So welcome. I am honored to be here today. We have such a great turnout. I think we're all shocked at how many of you came out from your busy schedules to share time with us today and for us to share and learn together. I'm Tammy Anderson-Wise. I'm the CEO of the Dairy Council of California, and I'm led by a passion of your product, dairy foods, in healthy eating patterns. Also in the ability to elevate the health of kids and families in California, and to be able to promote the fact that you all are producing healthy products and helping to contribute to community health. We have a very talented panel of speakers here today, and we're going to talk about dairy's role in healthy, sustainable diet. Nourishing a growing population while conserving natural resources is of local and global concern. And the idea of sustainable nutrition requires further consensus science to guide future recommendations. Can I get some help? Can you advance the slides for me, please? There we go. Our session objectives today. We're going to explore consumer perceptions and expectations around eating. As we heard earlier, consumer values are very important, and reception is reality with the consumer. We're going to review the nutrient advantages dairy foods contribute to an affordable, sustainable diet. We're going to discuss the capabilities of different types of sustainable food modeling systems. And we're also going to learn what dairy farmers are doing to decrease environmental burdens on producing dairy products. There we go. All right. So the climate change focus has shifted. Before, climate change discussions focused on industrial pollution and air quality. Now the focus has shifted to include agriculture, with a bigger focus on animal agriculture and changing how we eat. Since the passage of its landmark global warming law in 2006, California has been reducing carbon emissions from cars, trucks, homes, and factories while boosting production of renewable energy. As you know, Governor Brown signed SB 1383 to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. Part of the law set goals for California to cut methane from livestock 40% by 2030. Multiple reports also discuss diets and sustainability issues. Over the last decade, multiple reports have come out to discuss diets related to sustainability and planetary health. Healthy eating is no longer being solely defined by how it contributes to individual and population health, but also how it contributes to the health of the planet. And just this past August, the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine hosted a sustainable diet workshop in DC to explore sustainable diets and relevant impacts of cross-sector partnerships, policy, and research. The international community acknowledges that a definition and a set of guiding principles for sustainable diets was urgently needed to address food and nutrition security, as well as sustainability along the whole food chain. This definition by the FAO is what is the most agreed upon definition at this time. The issue of sustainable diets is complicated. Today we're going to learn more about dairy's role in the health of sustainable diets. Today's speakers will share dairy's contribution to health and sustainable food systems and provide you with the research to navigate this complicated topic. So with that, I'm going to introduce our four panelists, who will then give a brief presentation on their topic area, and then we'll have time for question and answers. So our first panelist is Katie Brown. Katie is the Senior Vice President of Sustainable Nutrition for National Dairy Council. She has a passion for connecting agriculture, food, nutrition, and health to elevate the status of nutrition as relevant, meaningful, and actionable. She leads thought leader and education efforts to educate people on the benefits of dairy to health and sustainable food systems across the lifespan. Katie will share the research related to the nutrient density of dairy foods and its important contribution to healthy eating patterns. Our second panelist, Marianne Smith-Edge. Marianne is a senior associate with the Context Network. She is a recognized nutrition and sustainability thought leader and the founder and principal of the AgriNutrition Edge, a consultancy committed to assisting food, health, agriculture organizations better navigate the changing consumer environment. Marianne will share the consumer perception and expectations around eating with a focus on food waste, which has been identified as a large part of the solution to feeding our growing population. Our third panelist, Cindy Schweitzer. Cindy is founder of Schweitzer Consulting, LLC, to provide nutrition and food science expertise for the food industry, including insights about complex diet-health relationships, translating scientific evidence, and identifying research priorities. Her global technical expertise spans for more than 30 years in nonprofit, ingredient, and food service organizations. Cindy will share the capabilities of the different types of food modeling research in attempts to try and identify ideal dietary patterns that are nutritionally adequate and sustainable. And our fourth panelist, Lynn Giacomini. Lynn is Chief Operating Officer and co-owner of Reyes Farmstead Cheese Company. She began her career in sales and marketing in the wine industry in the early 1990s. In 1999, she assisted the family operation in transitioning a conventional dairy into an artisan farm cheese operation and now manages the operation and sales for the company. Lynn is involved in local and sustainable agricultural organizations in the community to preserve land and farming in Marin County, including the Marin Agricultural Land Trust and the Agricultural Institute of Marin. Lynn will share what dairy farmers are doing to decrease the environmental burden of producing dairy, improve animal care, and conserve resources, and highlight her company's sustainability efforts.
There we go. All right, thank you. Sustainable nutrition, so what is it? Why do we care about it, and what does it mean for dairy? So let's start with the why. You know, at the very core of our existence is the need for food. After all, right after oxygen and water, food is a third close in line for our survival. And what's helped move our modern society from a lifespan of about 40 years to one over 70 years is a lot to do with better, safer, more nutritious food. And better, safer, more nutritious food is more than just calories and fuel. Food and the nutrients in our food are transformative for human health. You know, consuming a diet that's rich in nutrient-dense foods and diet diversity helps transform human health. It allows us to meet our macronutrient needs, protein, carbohydrate, and fat, as well as our micronutrient needs, over 30 plus vitamins and minerals. That helps to optimize our health and helps us thrive as human beings. The challenge is nutritiously feeding a growing world population expected to reach nearly 10 billion people by 2050, and doing so without utilizing additional natural resources. You know, the global food demand is expected to grow by 2/3 in the next 30 years. A third of that coming from increased populations in developing countries, and the other third from increased urbanization and economic growth in emerging countries. So as the global middle class rises and is expected to triple by 2030, people achieving middle class status, which is the equivalent of $1.25 to $1.50 a day US, they're able to access and seek out more nutrient-rich foods. They're able to access adequate calories and more diverse types of foods, often animal source foods like meat and dairy and eggs, as well as animal source edible oils and fruits and vegetables. So this is a good thing, because then people are able to consume enough calories and macronutrients and micronutrients. But it also means that we have to grow more nutrient-dense foods, and again, do so without utilizing additional natural resources. This is the essence of sustainable nutrition. I'm sure you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 transformational goals developed by the United Nations, signed onto by the leaders of 193 countries in September of 2015. This is the global agenda of 2030 and sets the accountability for sustainable development for the next 15 years. Every one of these goals is a connection to dairy somehow, but particularly goal number 2, I think, which is to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture, is one where the dairy community has been a leader and continued to be one. As we just saw, the FAO has a globally accepted definition of a sustainable diet. And it says that sustainable diets are ones that have low environmental impacts, contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for current and future populations. They're protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, all while optimizing natural and human resources. It's a long list of important factors, and it's hard to identify foods that meet all of those important factors. Certainly it's multidimensional, it's multifactorial, and includes trade-offs between what's healthy for humans and healthy for the planet. Now, as this definition tells us and is underscored by the SDGs, identifying one metric, such as the environmental footprint of food, as the sole standard for a sustainable diet or a sustainable food is insufficient and inadequate. Case in point, Adam Drunowski has published, as others have as well, that the crop with the lowest land, water, and energy use to create is sugar, right? Low environmental costs, so good on the environmental side, but also low nutritional value, not so good on the nutrition side. So when we talk about sustainable diets and sustainable foods, it really needs to be in the context of social, economic, and environmental value. Now, the dairy community certainly contributes to healthy and sustainable food systems and has a good story to tell on the environmental, social, and economic contributions that it makes to individuals, families, communities, and society. And on the next 3 slides, I'm going to highlight some of the proof points of those 3 areas, and then my colleagues here are going to go into more detail on those aspects. So let's start with the social aspect and look at health. You know, from the very basic, milk is the foundation for all dairy foods, and it contributes 9 essential nutrients, each offering a unique benefit to the human body and to human health. Each of those essential nutrients are listed here. Now remember, an essential nutrient is one that's needed for survival. We have to have it, but the body can't make it or can't make it in sufficient quantities, so we must get it from food. Dairy milk provides 9 essential nutrients in every 8-ounce serving. Yogurt provides 7 essential nutrients in every 8-ounce serving, and cheese provides 6 essential nutrients for every 1.5-ounce serving. Dairy is a very unique food group. It's the only food group that provides both high-quality protein and calcium, in addition to these essential and important nutrients. Additionally, consumption of dairy has very positive health impacts. It's associated with strong bone health, particularly among children and adolescents. And consumption of dairy and milk products are associated with reducing some of the most prominent chronic diseases facing our country and in many other countries around the world: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure. Now, on environment. Dairy was a leader in completing its life cycle assessment back in 2008, and from that we learned that dairy contributes 2% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. From that data, we made a commitment to continuous improvement in stewardship and sustainability, including a voluntary goal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions or our carbon footprint by 25% by 2020. This commitment to continuous improvement is showcased in the Dairy Stewardship Commitment, which is a process of transparency and pre-competitive partners who report and showcase their commitment and their progress on the farm, in the field, and across the U.S. dairy company and value chain. Dairy farmers care deeply about their animals. As you know, 98% of milk in our country comes from farms participating in the Farmers Assuring Responsible Management, or the Farm Animal Care Program, the first livestock animal welfare program recognized by the International Standardization Organization. And of course, farmers care deeply about their land and conserving natural resources. They participate in recycling their water safely and reusing it multiple times on the farm, also participating in no-till farming and manure management practices that help to sequester carbon in the soil, improve soil health, reduce runoff, and restrain and contain water and nutrients in the land. Over the past 70 years, farmer practices have reduced land use by 90%, greenhouse gas emissions by 63%, water usage by 65%. It's an incredible story. It's really quite amazing. And then in the economic aspects, dairy farming contributes to economic stability. It's a unique product that offers a marketable product 365 days a year. Milk is real, fresh, local. It's produced in every state in the country and travels an average of less than 350 miles from farm to store. The dairy community supports 3 million jobs and contributes $625 billion to the U.S. economy every year. 95% of farms in the U.S. dairy farms are family owned and operated, and globally, 37 million farms around the world are led by women, and the livelihoods of 1 billion people are connected to dairy. So all of these proof points are examples of how the dairy community and the nutrient-rich foods that you produce help to support health of people and the planet and the global food chain now and in the future. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to my next colleague here.
Good morning, I'm Cindy Schweitzer, and I want to thank the organizers and Dairy Council of California for inviting me to speak here today at the summit. Okay, let's see if I can get the green button to work. The science behind sustainable diets and food systems is really, really complicated. It's evolving, and it's growing at an extremely fast pace. And today, we don't have all the answers regarding sustainable diets, but many people, and especially policymakers, want to act anyway because they want to demonstrate that they're actually doing something. And even without having all the information, they might be, making some policy decisions that have some unintended consequences. So what does the science really tell us about sustainable diets and food systems, and more particular, what does it say about dairy? So today I'm going to just give a very brief overview of some of the science that was captured in the published literature, and then highlight a few specific dairy examples where the dairy industry is taking a proactive lead to actually lead some of the research to have a better understanding of what dairy's role is in sustainable food systems. Up. Oh, the big green button. Thank you. Okay, great. As Katie already mentioned, sustainable diets and food systems are really viewed in what are called 3 domains of environment, social, and economic. And there's not universal agreement as to what makes up those 3 pillars or what methods are used to measure within those, but the science is definitely helping us define that information and what we should be looking at in terms of sustainable diets. So this is kind of the reference point that the research is really focusing on. And how does it stack up to that? So while I was still at Global Dairy Platform over the past 11 years, we initiated a sustainable diets database in 2015. And we were specifically looking at studies that captured dietary patterns, not individual foods, and their impact on some other aspect of sustainability, be it the social, such as nutrition and health, or economic aspects or environmental aspects. So the criteria was a little difficult to define specifically, but again, we were looking at dietary patterns and their effect on some other aspect of sustainability. And what we found is that there were 186 studies over a period of 3 years when we first started the database and then updated it. 186 studies met our criteria for looking at that evidence base. And we found that most of those studies, I guess it's no surprise, they were carried out in developed countries rather than the developing world, specifically in Europe and North America. And most of them, and some of them almost exclusively, focused only on greenhouse gas. So just one tiny element, really, of sustainability. Okay. trying to see my slide. A few studies started to engage multiple factors that looked at other economic or other aspects of the environment, but many of these studies also didn't even look at nutrient adequacy or health outcomes associated with those dietary patterns. So there clearly was a void in our knowledge base. And I guess it should be no surprise that most of those studies made a conclusion that we should be reducing our consumption of animal source foods, including dairy. And sometimes they made those statements about dairy even when they weren't analyzed in the specific study. So it clearly demonstrated the need for more standardized methods in this field to really broaden the focus, and a favorite topic of mine is needs more data. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip this slide and move to some research that our Dutch dairy colleagues conducted over the last couple of years. They were really interested in understanding that when recommendations are made to eat more plant foods and reduce our intake of animal foods like dairy, does it make a difference from an environmental standpoint? And they were specifically looking at greenhouse gas, which you will see in the green bars, and land use in the purple bars. In 2016, when the National Health Council in the Netherlands developed new dietary guidelines for the Dutch people, they also developed 10 different dietary patterns or menus that people could follow to help meet those dietary guidelines. So the Dutch researchers said, okay, let's look at those 10 diets and see what the environmental footprint of those diets is compared to the average diet. So I've selected just 5 out of those 10 menus, and the results are shown in this particular chart. The bars that have the circle around them is the average Dutch diet for a 35-year-old woman. Now, to their surprise, some of the diets, for example, on the far right, it says crazy about fruits and vegetables. It actually has a higher imprint on carbon emissions and land use than the average American or the average Dutch diet. And in contrast, the one on the other far end of the scale is the I Love Dairy or I Love Holland diet. Now, the I Love Holland diet is particularly rich in meat and dairy foods. So this was a surprising result that these particular diets didn't stack up from an environmental perspective the way they might have expected. Now, why is that? When they dove into the details a little bit further, they realized that to have a diverse diet, many people consume exotic fruits and vegetables. So as an example, a banana that gets imported from South America, for example, has a much greater footprint due to the transportation effects than an apple that's grown in the Netherlands. And to give you a little bit of perspective in the green box, you can see that just a single flight of one person from Thailand, or from the Netherlands to Thailand, has an enormous carbon footprint, and it essentially wipes out the entire value of consuming a vegan diet for an entire year. So transportation, context, details really matter. Then they also did some other modeling, and again, they looked at the average Dutch diet, and they said, what happens if we remove entire food groups from the diet? What does that impact, again, on greenhouse gas in the green bars and land use in the purple bars? The average Dutch diet, again, is at the top of that bar chart, and the next one down is no dairy. And you can see that there's really very little difference in the carbon footprint in this particular example between the average diet and if you took dairy out. Now, if you remove meat, you see a much bigger impact, and all the way to the bottom set of bars there, if you remove all animal foods from the diet, you can have an impact up to about reducing greenhouse gas maybe up to 40%. Now, today, most consumers are not willing to go to a vegan diet, and this does demonstrate that context is really important, and it's not so simple to create a sustainable diet when you're just told reduce animal foods and just eat more plant foods. So I think this is a really important study of something that we definitely need to see more of. Okay, earlier this year in June, a new report from the Food and Agriculture Organization in collaboration with Global Dairy Platform and the International Farm Comparison Network looked at some of the socioeconomic benefits of dairying. Now, they collected information about dairying mostly in developing countries when either a family received a cow to produce milk or they received education to improve the productivity of their cows and therefore have more milk. So, not unexpected, when people had more milk in the household, they consumed more milk, they had better nutrient adequacy. But they also sold that milk, and so people throughout the community also had improvement in their nutritional status. And in fact, some of the health outcomes, such as stunting, in some studies was found to be reduced. So there's a health impact as well. Then from an economic standpoint, it increased the income of the individual farmers anywhere from 27 to 600%. And it went beyond those individual farm families and again, created jobs throughout the entire value chain. So again, the community had more jobs and more income, all saw a benefit from that. Now, the manure was not treated as a waste, but it was used as fertilizer, which also helped improve the crops that they grew and get better productivity from them as well. And if the animals were used as labor, they were able to extend the cropland that they could actually cultivate. So this is a really great report. It's a preliminary report. You can find it on the FAO website. The full report should be published there soon to really demonstrate that there's some other aspects about dairying that make it so important to help achieve the sustainable dairy goals, especially to reduce poverty and zero hunger. Okay, lastly, I want to bring to your attention some new work that's going to come out probably early next year, and it's called a report from the Eat Lancet Commission. Now, the Eat organization was started by a wealthy Swedish physician philanthropist, and her desire was to fund research to help fill that gap, and her context was the food system is broken. We have too much undernutrition and too much overnutrition. And then she partnered with the prestigious journal, The Lancet, so that the results of the research would have greater credibility, and also so that the results would have a global reach and therefore have greater influence. So the context around the research and what she was really interested really falls into two categories. And the first was, as I already mentioned, undernutrition. Stunting is still a huge problem in many parts of the world, and overnutrition, which leads to increased risk for chronic diseases. And the other aspect was greenhouse gas, because increasing greenhouse gases has a particular influence on climate change. So that was the basis really of her interest. From my perspective, it's unfortunate that they didn't take it a step further and really evaluate some of those other sustainability aspects beyond just greenhouse gas. But I guess you have to start somewhere. So they selected 20 individuals to serve as a steering group, and that included some of the influencers and staff from the World Health Organization, as well as the FAO, and some of you might be familiar with a researcher by the name of Walter Willett, who helps chair this group. Now, they were divided into 5 groups with a goal of trying to gather the evidence in the different research areas, all the way from looking at what makes a healthy diet, how do we transform what we eat into having better health outcomes, to what makes up sustainable, production, agricultural production for the food system, and all the way to the cycle that looks at, well, what are some of the solutions that we can offer, and what are some of the policy utensils that we can also use to help make things happen. Okay, so it's very likely that this group of individuals and the reports that they come out will make some strong recommendations to reduce dairy consumption. And why do I say that? Because some of the first research has now been published just a few weeks ago in The Lancet. I'll give a brief overview of what this research looks like, and this particular paper has a lot of diet modeling in it, and I just selected a couple things to share with you today. But they looked at 3 different dietary change strategies, everything from initially just replacing some of the animal foods, so that was kind of an environmental focus to reduce greenhouse gas, a food security focus where they wanted to make sure people actually maintained an optimum weight rather than being underweight or overweight. And thirdly, a public health focus. People are already choosing diets like vegan or flexitarian or omnivorous or whatever it is. So how do those particular diets have an influence on various health outcomes as well as greenhouse gas? So the impacts they assessed were things like nutrient adequacy, mortality, and environmental aspects. And they also stratified that. They looked at it as a global population and then throughout their economic status as well. So I just put on this chart an analysis of replacing foods and looking at mortality on the global population. So just 3 of those factors, okay? And what you can see is the more you replaced animal foods, so it's from 25% on the left to 100% on the right. That's the way the bars go. You have a reduction in both total and premature mortality. So that's an analysis of health outcomes. Many of the other iterations in dietary modeling that they did make similar conclusions in that it's really best to remove animal products from our diet and replace them with things like fruits, vegetables, and legumes because it has a health impact. Okay? So what I'm concerned about is that this is just one little piece of paper that's coming out, and we know there's going to be a lot more. So as a dairy sector, I think it's really important that we gather the information we have about dairy and the positive things that we have so that when this report comes out next year, we're ready to tell our story, and it's not one-sided, and that's all that they hear is what comes from this. And we have a lot of good things to say. So I want to leave you with just 3 really excellent resources. The first one on the left is a report from the Livestock Division of FAO, and it goes into really great details, including some information about dairy. So if you're interested in sustainable food systems from a livestock perspective, this report's a great one for that. In the middle is a review paper written by Dr. Jeremy Hill. He's a chief science officer at Fonterra, and he really describes dairy from the framework of all aspects of sustainability, so it's not just greenhouse gas, and it's a really excellent review. And then the third resource on there is a great tool developed by the International Dairy Foods Association, and it's a modeling tool where you can look at economic benefits of U.S. dairy in terms of like jobs and wages and things like that. So I suggest if you want more details that you look at some of these. So I'll say thank you once again and turn it over to Marianne.
Thank you. It truly is a pleasure to be here, and it's always wonderful to be able to talk to a dairy audience. I am a dairy farmer's daughter, grew up in a small conventional dairy farm in Kentucky, and my father was a dairy farmer for over 50 years. So when I have the opportunity to talk dairy with other industry, it's always a pleasure. So to build on some of the conversation that you've just heard is that my piece is to really talk about the convergence of where sustainable diets and biodiversity has really started that conversation. And you keep hearing FAO, and I really think that a lot of the convergence really started back in 2010, probably earlier, but this is when some of the major discussion was about the fact that if we're moving into the 21st century, a healthy diet has to go beyond human health. It has to go between human health and really looking at the health of the planet. From that, it really began the discussion globally of talking about how does sustainability play into the dietary guidelines. And I have just thrown up three patterns or models from 3 countries, Sweden, Brazil, and the Netherlands, that since 2013 have included sustainability into their dietary guidance. And Cindy alluded to some of the modeling that's been done in the Netherlands in this regard. Whether it's followed or not, in many of these cases is that these global guidelines are really focusing that reduction and sustainable diets comes on reduction more of animal protein rather than looking at broad aspect. So fast forward, this becomes then the discussion in the U.S. on nutrition policy, and many of you in the room have been engaged in it. Dairy has definitely been very involved, and even though the discussions of sustainability has been around, and there was discussion in the 2010 dietary guidelines, and for those of you that aren't familiar, this is the discussion that occurs every 5 years. However, those of you that's really in the process know that it's just a continuous process. But the sustainability really became more highlighted in the last go-around in the 2015. In fact, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee was the first committee to submit a chapter on food safety and sustainability. But as you know, after much discussion, consternation, hearings, and is that when the final 2015-2020 dietary guidelines actually were published, is that they were not in because the Secretary of Agriculture and HHS deemed that sustainability did not fit into the guidelines. However, since that time is that, and this was just published in August in Lancet, is a report that was done on the modeling of the healthy diets that are featured in the dietary guidelines. It was done by New Hampshire, but also you have Timothy Griffin and Mim Nelson from Tufts. Both those two were associated with the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in 2015. What this basically says, and you can look at it, is that some things to note is why all the discussion, first of all, about dietary guidelines and why is that important. If you see at the very top, it basically is the guide that directs over $80 billion of federal spending. That's an economic consideration in that regard. And then the second thing here is that from the modeling, it did come out that of course, the traditional, more healthy guidelines plus the dairy plus the Mediterranean, they looked at only 6 impacts, had similar impacts, and needless to say, the vegetarian pattern did look better except for water usage. But the reality here is they're saying is that from the conclusion of the authors that if we're really talking about dietary guidelines, then we're also talking about food security, and part of that comes to dietary guidance. There was also an op-ed in the same journal that basically says that we really do have to look at the convergence, and agriculture is being seen as the convergence between food production and food consumption. So if we're going to be healthy, we have to look at it across the platform. So where do we go in dietary guidelines? And I was at the August meeting of Sustainable Diets in D.C., and the reality is that there will be discussion, probably not so much in the 2020. There is some suggestions that perhaps a task force needs to be convened to really look at this issue as some other special task force have been developed when you introduce new concepts into the dietary guidelines. But what do consumers say? And you've already heard about it, but how does what policy say talk about consumers? Mintel just released last week their top 3 global trends for 2019. First one, evergreen consumption, saying that consumers are concerned about sustainability, but now they're looking at it as a 360, not only how food is being produced, but how it's being used and how it's being recycled back into regenerative agriculture and soil health. This is information, though, from the 2018 IFIC Foundation Food and Health Survey, that even though that 60% of consumers say they have sustainability plays a part into their purchasing decisions, what's interesting, and as the earlier panel said, how they define it is not how we're talking about it today. As you can see, reduction of pesticides and an affordable food supply were top of mind. But will you pay more? And this was from 2 years ago, same IFIC survey, is that consumers, about a little over a third, said that they would be willing to pay more. But as you can see, the profile of those that say they would be, it's not surprising. It's those who have higher incomes and better educated. So what does this mean when we talk about animal versus plant? And I think we kind of lose the context when it's either them versus, it's one versus the other. Because if you really look at the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines, it really, yes, it is plant-based, because the fact is half of our plate is supposed to be fruits and vegetables, but it does have animal-based protein, and it profiles dairy very well, as Katie has said previously, because we recognize not only the benefit of health from consuming more fruits and vegetables, but also dairy as well. What's interesting is perhaps we should focus not so much on animal versus plant, but the fact of the consumption, because from the IFIC survey, when individuals were asked, what did their typical average dinner plate look like? You can see is that most of them described that about 40% of their plate was protein, which is almost twice as much as what's really recommended. So perhaps it's not changing the guidelines, but actually following the guidelines. The good news is that at least about 50% said that often or usually they include dairy in their diet. But here's the real issue, is perhaps it's not about, it really is about food waste, because how much food is on the plate is actually wasted or goes to the waste. And so when you look at it here, these numbers we keep talking about, 40% of the food is wasted. We, consumers, waste. And it's not only in the field, but it's in our refrigerators as well. We won't talk about how much you wasted at Thanksgiving. Maybe you ate it all. But I think this number is that if food waste was their own country, they would be the third largest global greenhouse gas emitter behind China and the U.S. That's an issue. While 1 out of 6 people in our country still go hungry. So when we talk about how do we connect the dots, and I think the James Beard Foundation has just come out with a cookbook called Waste Not. You know, when chefs get behind an issue, movement starts. And in this one, it's a very good thing because, you know, if you read the quote up here, it basically says, we're all concerned about recycling while we let fur grow on our food in the refrigerator and be ready to throw it out to the landfill, that perhaps we're not connecting the dots in this particular area. So when we talk about life cycle assessments, I'm proposing that when we look at overall guidance and looking at food waste, is perhaps we should think about our own lifestyle assessment for sustainability. I'm coining it as an LSA, because if you really look at sustainable eating, if we just started with the dietary guidelines definitely as a starting point, it is more sustainable. It puts it in perspective where animal and plant should be. And it does talk about nutrient-rich, reduces nutrient energy-dense products. And it really talks about waste. So I think the key here might not be so much animal versus plant, but collectively, and is how do we reduce food waste? And dairy and the dairy industry has some excellent ways to talk about it. What you have done on the farm, think about whey. Whey we used to throw away. And look at how valuable. These are the examples where consumers are looking for that 360 conversation and wanting to know about where their food is. I think we can lead the conversation from a dairy perspective. Because how does our food consumption actually impact the environment is a question to have. So when we look at all the food waste and sustainability resources, as we know, there are government programs, there are active food waste programs that are going on within retail, within various retails, within food service operations. But the key here is how can we collectively build on the issue? Because if, reducing food waste on our plate can also reduce our waste. And so the reality is that dairy has a great opportunity to build on the story, and you're going to hear some great things from Lynn as well. Thank you.
I know everybody's ready for lunch, I'm guessing, pretty soon. I'm sorry we didn't have cheese here today. My dad's in the audience and he's going to kill me for not bringing cheese to all your tables. I'm Lynn Giacomini Stray, and I am a very proud owner of Robert Giacomini Dairy. We have a dairy that is 2 hours west directly here out on the coast on Highway 1. We're on about 700 acres, and there's our farm right there. We milk about 450 Holstein cows. When I was asked to be on this panel with all these wonderful women with backgrounds in nutritional science and their PhDs, I thought, okay, what do we have to contribute? Well, I think our story is very similar to a lot of the stories that are in this room, especially when you have generational dairy families that are trying to figure out how to pass on that dairy business and to make an impact in today's society and into the consumers' minds and making a benefit of the products and what we're doing on the farm. Sustainability to us is to continue improvement on our farm, doing something on our farm so that it will be there for generations to come, just like our families have done that before us. We do things with partners. It's very important. For example, our land will be in agriculture and be viable in agriculture in perpetuity because of a partnership with our Marin Agricultural Land Trust, where we've sold our easement, our development rights, so that it will never be developed on. It's one of our examples. I'll talk more about partners in a minute. Our history really goes back to my great-grandfather was an immigrant from Italy and came over in the early 1900s looking for fertile land in California to start his agricultural business for his family. And he landed in Petaluma and had a chicken farm, about 500 chickens and a few cows. About 30 years later, my grandfather, Waldo Giacomini, moved his family out to Point Reyes, just 20 minutes west of where his father was. And he started a cow dairy and sold the fluid milk, similar to a lot of you out there. Well, that worked out well for a long time until some environmental pressures really forced him to look at his land. He was at the base of Tamales Bay. Eventually, the National Park Service purchased his land and restored it into natural wetlands. So environmentalists and agriculturists have been coming together for many years to really step up to resolve a lot of these environmental issues and yet still be profitable on land. So my grandfather, he passed away in 2002, and his land was preserved, as I mentioned, into wetlands. In 1959, my father came home from UC Davis, and our grandfather said, there's a ranch up the road about 3 miles north of the town of Point Reyes, and it's for sale. How about if we add that to our family corporation? So my parents moved in and started running this ranch that you see here in 1959. They too had a successful fluid milk dairy for about 40 years. Had 4 daughters, exactly what every dairyman dreams of. And just as he dreamed, we really actually had no interest in the dairy business or in animals, but we loved to travel and we loved food. My mother was very strong on education and wanted us to go out into the world and follow our own passions. Little did we realize growing up that as much as we wanted to move away, we wanted to come home. And so it wasn't until the late 90s that our father sat us down and said, what are we going to do with the family farm? We've got to be able to continue this or potentially sell, because conventional dairying, as it is today, hasn't really changed much with the price of milk. So we followed his vision. He always wanted to have a product off of the farm. And so we started talking about cheese. A value-added product is what has saved our farm. And today you might know us more as Point Reyes Farmstead or Original Blue, our blue cheese that we started making in 2000. We put our milk into the vat in 2000 and really changed everything that we were doing and survived our farm. So when we talk about sustainability, it's about being flexible, looking into the future, and figuring out ways that we can continue to farm. Having said that, we've got a lot of challenges today, as was mentioned earlier on the panels, with the new generation and questions about dairying, questions about animal welfare. How do we combat that? How do we mitigate the greenhouse gases? So I want to talk a little bit about our environmental impact and some of the projects that we're working on. So we do have environmental best practices. We have a carbon farm plan that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, nutrient management, water reclamation, and renewable energy in feed as well. And I have to say that if we didn't have a value-added product off the farm, and I think this is something that I urge all small dairy farms to look at, we wouldn't be able to really utilize, by being vertically integrated, we would not be able to really utilize all of our resources on the farm in a continuous sustainable loop. And that will show in some of our best practices. This is a picture, of course, we grow some ryegrass annually, and we are cutting the silage in the background. Carbon farm plan. We are a part of the Marin Carbon Project, which is a collaboration between the UC Extension and the Marin Agricultural Land Trust in putting together a plan so that we can utilize our nutrients, find out, water reclamation, making sure that we have clean water, that we are using our resources on the land as much as possible, and being able to reap those rewards, making sure that our nutrients are going into the soil. We believe in a healthy land, healthy soil equals healthy animals, so that we have great quality milk. All part of being stewards on the land. We're identifying opportunities, whether it's putting up windrows to make sure that our nutrients aren't blowing away, compost dryers, those are things that we're looking into at this time through our plan. This carbon farm plan is very specific to our soil and what's happening and how we're rotating our pastures so that we can use this narrative in identifying projects for the future for grants and other funds available through state and federal agencies. Water reuse. Water, as we all know, is probably one of the biggest commodities that we all cherish. We have through our creamery that's on the property, we're able to reuse a lot of our water through our sanitation process. So we're holding our water and we're reusing that through our CIP system and sanitation for over a week. And then we're able to put it over into the dairy and help wash down our dairy barns. So once again, having another resource, a creamery on the farm is able to allow us to reuse those resources. As you can see, we're using about 5,000 gallons a day just in the creamery on water. Methane digester, that's been mentioned here quite a bit already today. In 2006, we'd been making cheese for 6 years, and we started to continually see our inputs increasing and our milk prices kind of still being the same. We looked at what can we control on the farm, and energy was one of them, and so we did an energy audit, and methane won out. We had the raw material, and in 2009, we put in a methane digester that has a lot of benefits. It runs an 80 kilowatt generator, which services about 60 to 65% of our energy needs. Helps us heat up water as well. I'm going to kind of go through this a little bit quicker because I know that we are running short on time, but here is a great example of the different ways that we can reuse our waste. Everything from composting our solids, not only capturing the methane off of the digester, but then putting that natural fertilizer on our soil so that it can retain more moisture into the land. We also sell it to other farmers that may be growing road crops. That was mentioned earlier today. I think Frank mentioned the nutrients from animals going into plant-based items. Quickly, I want to just talk about nutrition. A lot of you dairy farmers here, we all probably have the same commodity barn. We only grow about 30% of our animals' diet right on the farm where they graze, and then we cut for silage. The rest of it is our TMR, which includes things like cottonseed, almond hulls, canola pellets, and so on. But a lot of these items, they were either burned or in landfills or down the river. With the amazing structure of an animal, the ruminant, they're able to digest a lot of this that was unused before, or we didn't understand the nutritional value. Not only is it a way to capture a lot of that food that was going to waste as a byproduct, but it is also, it's providing healthy nutrients for the animals. And you can see some of the waste. This is a California Milk Advisory Board slide here that shows the waste and how much waste that they're eating with those garbage trucks over there. Here are our cheeses. And the last thing is, agritourism and social impact. We talk a lot about stories here today. And it's about bringing people to a table. It's about telling your story. Brands, loyalty with brands are so important. For us, we have a culinary center on the farm. We started that 10 years ago, number one for the trade, so we could bring in chefs and retailers and distributors from around the U.S. to educate them about everything that's happening on the farm. And we talked about connecting the dots. Everybody that comes on our farm starts with a walking tour of the farm so they can understand what's happening out on the farm. It's not just our farm, it's every farm across the United States, how much work and love that goes into it, and the exciting innovations in technology that's happening to make sure that we are staying sustainable, that we are part of the bigger picture with climate change and all that we're doing. There is a bright future out there for dairy, and I think it can be in a lot of our family brands and telling that story. Let's see where we are here. So we invite everybody to come and visit, and I know we're kind of rushed on time and we've got some questions, so I'm going to hand this back to Tammy. But thank you so much for coming out and learning more and sharing all of our stories today.